Welcome, guys, to the New York City Multifamily Podcast. Shaun Riney. We're joined by our friend and client, Aron Harkham, in from LA. Welcome, Aron. Thank you for joining us.
When did you fly in?
Sunday morning.
Okay, so you've been here a little bit.
Sunday morning.
Yeah.
There you go. So we got to know each other. We did a couple of deals during the pandemic, and we became friends, and we were basically talking almost every day for a year, which is kind of crazy to think about. But why don't you have a really interesting backstory, and we can talk about what led you into these deals that you bought up in Washington Heights. But why don't you give everyone sort of like your history and
Sure.
story?
It's a funny thing. The best way I feel like to become friends with someone is to do a deal with me, because you'll never have a few days without talking.
Yeah.
But it's really great to be here and really fun to see what we've done in the last year or so. But I think that, in the conversation about what we look for and how we buy, why we buy, what we bought, I think that our family story plays so much into that. And interestingly enough, I think that most families and people that own real estate, people forget that there's a reason that they own what they own, and it's it's usually a larger story than
It's a larger story, a lot of hard work.
but it's also the types of things that people buy. It's it's what you buy is like why certain people buy a certain car or watch or whatever it is. There's a whole story that gets to that point of why they like what they like.
Right.
So for us, my family had lived in Iraq for since 2,000 years ago until 1951. And they were kicked out one day in the middle of the night, my grandparents and their 6 kids at the time. My dad wasn't born yet. They got to Israel, went from a upper middle class lifestyle and pretty much arrived in a displaced person camp I recently found photos of it actually. It's wild to see, really crazy, dirt roads, tents, like metal and wooden beds, mattresses strewn all over the floor, crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
So my dad was born there in 1956 in that kind of a life. And it was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of movement, severe poverty. And they made it through that, through a lot of hard work and dedication. And finally got to a house in Israel and then moved to Australia in 1967. They were still poor, but not abjectly poor. There, my dad had a very challenging life.
Can I pause you for one second?
Yeah.
Why did they move from Israel to Australia?
So they were going to go, apparently the story goes, they were going to go to Chicago. And why that, I have no idea. I think it all had to do with pretty much where you could know someone and where you had a job that you could pick up and provide for at that point they had 8 kids, a lot of whom were pretty young. So where would you figure it out? Keep in mind, English was not their first language, and it's a pretty tough reality. So at that point, they would have wanted somewhere where there was a community of people that either spoke Hebrew or Arabic, which was their first language, and somewhere they could have made ends meet. So they were going to go to Chicago, and my grandfather's sister was at their house one day and basically said, "Are you crazy? Chicago's freezing. You're going to die there."
Right. Right. These are
Not
desert.
Yeah, exactly. And they had a cousin in Sydney. And so my grandfather sent one of the older brothers to go there and find a place to live and start a business. And basically a year later, they all used their last pennies up and made the voyage to Australia. That had its own challenges. My dad was really severely bullied and beat up pretty much every day, close to an inch of his life, often.
Is this
Broken
around?
bones and
This is like around anti-Semitism.
anti-Semitism. Yeah, he's dark-skinned Israeli kid
Yeah.
that didn't really speak English well, and they beat the living hell out of him. And then when he was about 18, he started a company with one of his brothers and did very well in clothing. And it was really, as the story goes, it was pretty much their persistence, and specifically his persistence in not accepting no. They would just say, we're not interested, we're not interested, we're not interested. Everyone else would, week after week, just give up, and he kept coming. And so the buyer felt bad enough for him at a certain point that she said, okay, we'll take a couple of the dresses and see how they sell. And they
Not
sold
so
well.
different than our job.
It sounds pretty
Yeah,
similar to a brokerage.
it's really, a lot of things and a lot of success when you speak to enough people, you realize that it comes down to a couple of really key attributes. One of which is just not accepting no and just continuing to try, which I think was an amazing lesson for me. And I feel so lucky to be a part of that from a family history perspective. A legacy of not giving up, which is, critical when you're displaced and, you lose everything and you can have the gumption and ability to start again. So he pretty quickly did very, very well, and then continued to expand, move to America. And while he was growing that fashion business with one brother and then another, they basically just bought real estate. They were very, very risk averse when it came to leverage. They didn't trust banks very
They
much.
buy a lot of the existing real estate that they were already a tenant in.
In Australia, they bought buildings that they were manufacturing in, that they had their offices in, and then residential as well. But a lot of the time, it was more specifically the real estate that they understood.
Yeah.
Right. This is like in the 80s now we're talking
This
about?
is like late 70s,
Okay,
early
got it.
80s.
Okay.
In LA, they were buying in downtown. Aside from buying homes and things like that, they were buying in downtown LA where they had their manufacturing, and that was where they were. And interestingly enough, and this is something we'll probably touch on later, that I'm a really big history nerd, as you probably have heard by now. And I try to understand in everything. There's so much complexity. Like if you think about a battlefield or any historical event, right? People think about the troop movements and the hundreds of thousands of people and the guns and whatever it is, but a lot of the time it comes down to the weather, right? Like it comes down to the minute detail of complex, like was it muddy and could the chariots get through the mud?
Yeah.
Or, what kind of gunpowder one side was using versus the other. And I think if you analyze families and real estate and business generally in that way, you think about why people own what they own, and you think about where they come from. And a lot of the time you think, you realize so many people today, their parents and grandparents bought and built real estate, but real estate wasn't their business, right? They had a clothing business, or they were lawyers, or they were doctors, or whatever they did. And they used real estate as a storehouse of value. Over time, those other things aren't as good a storehouse of value. So they kind of disintegrated and died. But the real estate stayed.
Right. It seems like, from a lot of different, family, real estate dynasties, there was real estate was the side hustle. There was always a primary driver of income. Versus today's age, there's a lot of active income that this is the only source of income. But in troubled times, it becomes
because you needed the money. Like you had to do something first to accumulate,
to get the
even
money.
if it's just a small amount of money.
And
to go
even
buy
still, like with that real estate, it wasn't a lot of the time. It wasn't cash flowing so well, right? And they were able to buy things that if you were trying to underwrite it today, you just wouldn't be able to make sense of it a lot of the time.
So the Harkham family has a legacy of persistence and also a little bit of a contrarian attitude when it comes to basis versus cash flow.
Yeah,
if the deal feels right.
Everyone has to really look at it, I think, based on their own. What are you trying to get out of this business or this deal or this thing, whatever it is. And I think that over time that changes, right? When you have an operating business and you're in the fashion business or you have a law practice or whatever it is, you can buy a certain asset. And I think that, it's a very interesting thing for my generation and my job, working with my family, is to understand that times have changed and it's a different reality when real estate is your business than when real estate is your side hustle.
So this is, I'm really glad you said this because this comes up actually in our business a lot. And one of the questions that we ask people when we're sitting with them and talking about buying, selling, planning, etc., uh, what does owning the property do for you? And
Right.
when you ask someone that question, they've usually never been asked that. And they kind of look at you a little funny, like, what do you mean, man? And to your point, I think it's changed, right? They bought it because they had a use for it, right? Like in the ground
Mhm.
floor, or it was to make money. And now obviously the investments have changed, values, cash flows have changed, and maybe it doesn't make as much money as it did before, or maybe yeah, it used to be a cash flow play, and now as the values have gone up so much over the last 30 years in real estate, we find a lot of these people in the business uh, cash flow poor but equity rich,
Yep.
and you don't actually get the money until a capital event happens. So recalibrating them a little bit, right, Shaun, where you kind of got to knock them around a little bit, get them out of their comfort zone, and maybe change their way of thinking.
I mean, one of the ways I do that typically is just by saying, like, actually holding the building is costing you $500,000 every year because that's the opportunity cost
Right.
that you could have buying something for 6% cap rate when you're currently selling at a 3% just because somebody else will execute an upside that you don't have the excitement for. And very often, or I should say very rarely, do you improve value on something that you're not excited about? And so over the course of time, 10, 20, 30 years, people lose excitement about what they bought when they were 25 or 30. And it's up to you to recognize that and not
Yeah.
just sit, with your hands, but stay moving. But yeah, that's a typical conversation. I like that question. What does I know what you do for the property. What does the property do for you? That is an
And
interesting way.
it's a really funny thing when if you have a real estate family and you grow up around it and you see people that are in it, a lot of the time people forget that, right? You almost become a slave to your properties.
Oh,
or to your
you are
business or whatever it
totally
is.
on the rat wheel, especially
100%.
with New York City investment property. Like the income is technically passive income, but there's nothing passive about
It's the
running.
least passive.
It's the least passive
Yeah.
investment income you could possibly
Yeah.
have. But let's fast forward a little bit to like 2020, right? You guys had this exchange out.
Pandemic 2020.
Pandemic
March
2020.
2020 around.
Pandemic. So the exchange was December of 21.
December of 21.
Yeah,
Okay, excuse me.
towards the tail end of the pandemic, but
Okay.
it still felt like it was. It was actually Omicron, which was that's why I think you're remembering it as pandemic.
Maybe,
It was
yes.
the
Yes.
resurgence.
Yes,
early
yes, yes.
22.
So, okay, so what happened? We started talking. You were in this huge exchange.
Yeah,
My
it was-
eyes were like saucers.
Yeah.
So what happened?
So, thank God, things really worked out for the best. We sold an asset that we've owned for a very long time in Los Angeles. And basically, we were looking at that equation of, this is something that was bought for very little. A lot of work, a lot of very, very hard work went into it. And something that honestly I've learned so much from my dad was the degree of care that he had on Rodeo Drive in really improving not just his building, but improving the street, and really making an effort through the community and bringing people together to increase advertising budgets, and make sure that Rodeo Drive was what it has become in the
So
80s.
You bought it in
and
1995.
95,
Right? So that
yeah.
you basically that was a part of the pro forma, which is not in anybody's perspective. But
Yeah.
to
And
make everything around
Yeah.
it nice.
The
Some
truth
people would call
was-
that gentrification. Other people would call it adding value and improving.
Yeah, it would. I think that part of the interesting thing was there was no pro forma. It
Oh,
was
that's interesting.
there was no analysis. There was no, cash flow statement. It was just my dad was in the hotel business and he saw a hotel for sale. And it was, it was a chance meeting after a chance meeting. He went to honor some council member that had helped him with something, and he didn't want to, be ungrateful for what this guy had done. And while he was at the table, he started talking to the person next to him who was a broker, and They connected after that lunch, and this guy sold him the hotel. And it was at the time it was a very. I recently found the OM from '95.
Get out of here.
Yeah, and it was being marketed at, I think it was marketed at 18, and it's just very indicative of people think about things so differently after it's already become a thing.
Yeah.
But it didn't sell for 18, it sold for 12 and a half, right? So it was a high price to pay at the time, and it was a hard thing to make sense of. It was a cash flow negative asset. And I think that if my dad would have had today's mindset of how does this pro forma, he never would have bought it in a million years. Right.
And so you ended up in it with it, and I have to commend you, because most people, the idea of even doing a $5 million exchange, let alone a $200 million plus exchange, is very daunting, especially during that time, because it was very hard to even get sellers to react. It was one of these, there's a lot of uncertainty in the market. We had the rent laws, we had just, no one knew where values were.
People very flip-floppy.
And it's not always easy to even pin down a seller in normal times, let alone when there's a little bit of uncertainty about where valuations are. So, kudos to you. I was curious if there was any, kind of learning lessons that, go with executing an exchange that big. Like, how did you differentiate what to spend your time on? Because you bought in multiple markets. You bought industrial. You bought mixed use in LA. You bought rent regulated in New York City. You bought Soho. How did you go about the task of that, or were you just not sleeping for 6 months?
Both are true. I definitely had a number of office, slumber parties. I moved into the office for probably 2 to 3 days a week, which was tough. It definitely wasn't easy, but I feel like, everyone has a hard job at one point or another. I feel very, very lucky that this is my hard job. And I think that in the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to the degree that people feel entitled to have what they have or do what they do or whatever it is, that because they're, X, Y, or Z, they deserve to be relaxed, or they deserve to not be stressed out or work hard or whatever it is. But in the end of the day, it's a privilege to be able to work hard at something you enjoy. So that was, I think, the first thing. And I got very, very lucky with a number of amazing advisors and confidants, people, just really great people, like Mark Schillinger, who I think you met in LA.
Yeah.
And, it came down to a lot of theory of what do I want? What do we want from a portfolio perspective? What do I want our reality to look like in 15, 20 years from now?
Oh, so you were thinking about it almost like for your kids, not necessarily.
Yeah. Meaning, where do you want to be down the road 2, 3 economic cycles away? And then...
That's interesting. So
where's the hockey puck going?
Yeah, where's the hockey puck going?
Yeah. So the idea was pretty much that you can't really look at a single asset at a time on that kind of a thing, right? It's something where you have the ability to reinvent, and you have the ability to really do something so paradigm shift kind of a thing for your family, that you have to think bigger. And so for us, it was really that, focal point, time-wise, of where do you create that shift. So a lot of it was buying in areas that I want to buy in for the next 20 years. So we bought, for example, San Francisco high street retail, because I want to own more of that over the next 20 years. And then basically to create portfolios surrounding each of the properties that we bought in the exchange. Hollywood, I think, is an amazing market. West Hollywood is an amazing market. There are challenges over the course of time with regard to vacancy and tenancy and cities and taxes and all of that. But I think over the course of time, if you're buying things well, for example, we bought something across the street from the farmers market at the Grove in LA, incredibly unique building. And I think that long term, buying more in that area will be an incredible portfolio to own. New York, obviously we bought the Uptown properties, 555 and 596 Edgecombe, uh, that was the intention. There was to buy a portfolio over the next 20 years, and to keep adding on to that portfolio and being able to essentially create efficiencies through scale, where 20 years down the line, you're looking at 15, 20 buildings within that area that you're able to create efficiencies, and also to be able to have a good relationship with your tenants, good relationship with the city, good relationship generally with the powers that be, um, and to be efficient with that. Soho, we bought 2 buildings, um, of retail, and mixed use, some office. Also, the goal is to have a Soho portfolio. So over time, if you think about it in that way, it makes more sense. And then the next, and kind of the last thing I'll say on that is, we were in a very strange moment in time, which was essentially, you know, treasuries at zero at that time,
That's
right?
yeah.
Interest rates were on floating in the mid twos, fixed 7 to 10 years, low threes. Right? Very
Yeah.
different
Yeah.
reality
Yeah. Oh,
to
yeah.
today.
This was free money.
So essentially, part of my job is to think about time a little bit differently than most people do, because they're thinking about a 5 to 10 year investment horizon, and I'm thinking about it much longer. So we have to think more about what is the actual true value, agnostic of a cycle,
Mm-hmm.
right? So everyone is going crazy on multifamily in Houston or Austin or Nashville or wherever, insert
Mm-hmm.
submarket
Yeah. Yeah.
where people are paying
Sunbelt,
2.8 caps.
no rent
Yeah.
regulation.
All in trouble now.
Yeah.
But they're looking at it from the perspective of, I can borrow at X, I can raise at Y, I can,
There's the syndicator model, and
Yeah.
you're looking at it
Right.
like the family office model.
So
And I remember getting emails from you, just, I'm in the market for a trophy building at a very discounted price per foot, because you're thinking, that's the one thing I can control is my
Yeah.
basis.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
correct. And no one wanted those.
And
right?
no
No
one
one
wanted
wanted
those.
this. We're
you look
coming
at-
out of
look
COVID.
at every
like,
deal that I bought from that exchange. Not one of them was something anyone else wanted at the time.
I know.
Right,
It's,
and just for the listeners, one of the properties uptown was originally a $65 million asking price, I think, by Seth Glasser. So it was
Yeah.
ultimately sold at a 57% price discount.
yeah.
And just a fantastic Art Deco
I mean, it was
monster of a building.
it's been 2 years now, I guess, since we closed, but I'll never forget the building. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
it was the most, and it is the most impressive historic buildings, right? You've had all these old famous jazz musicians that lived in the building at one point.
Mhm.
It was owned by the same family for a very long time, and there was certainly some, and they still live in the building.
They still do.
You bought the
and
building.
they're fantastic.
You
They're
bought
really
the
great.
building 2 years ago. They're still in there, and this was at a point when nobody really wanted to buy rent-regulated buildings because you had the eviction moratorium. This is post HSTPA. All the syndicator money was flowing, like you said, right to the Sunbelt states. No rent regulation, and in comes this guy on, knight in shining armor in a massive exchange, sold a property on Rodeo Drive and bought a bunch of rent-stabilized apartments in Washington Heights. And
Which of the investments that you bought, has performed the best 2 years later?
I would say the 2 best performers would have to be 206 Spring Street, and which is ground floor retail restaurant, with office above it, boutique office, like 2,200, 2,500 foot floor plates.
Okay.
nice.
Gorgeous building, light on both sides, which is rare, and just overall really beautiful, clean building that we bought. And then the other one that I really, really love is kind of a development site, but also a really special building in Hollywood,
Okay.
Seward Street in Santa Monica. That was a vacant, roughly 25,000 square foot building on almost 70,000 feet of land
Got
in
it.
an
Wow.
amazing neighborhood.
Industrial play, like lease?
No, so we leased it. We leased half of it to a really reputable gallery, Marion Goodman Gallery, that came out of New York, and they're in Paris and London, South Africa. Very, very special gallery. So they've made it incredibly beautiful. We leased it very nicely, and the other half we're negotiating a lease now. But it will make sense, I think, on the whole deal, 70,000 feet of land in that area, which is almost 85% of the block. We'll be holding that at close to an 8 cap. So
wow. Yeah, I mean, that's like the ultimate dream. That's the dream in New York City too. Everyone always talks about, I want to cover land play, and you basically made it a cover land play by finding tenants for it. But the idea of having something simple with commercial tenants that generally pay their own expenses, where you have this future development play, that's a business plan that you can actually scale and is not so complicated to run, and just have that
hard to model out though,
which is why the Bronx retail strip centers. I mean, if you can find one of those in a high street retail traffic corridor, they never sell because no one really has an itch to sell them. But when you do, they sell like hotcakes.
Yeah, totally.
$1 a foot.
Yeah, this is really amazing to hear the whole story, because you're in a time crunch, obviously, for your exchange. You ended up buying, how many different deals did you have to do to
15.
satisfy? You did 15 deals for your exchange, and we have clients who freak out doing one.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, I mean, do you think that you would have ever pulled this off if not for the time constraints? Like, sometimes what I've tried to remind people is, you need a little pressure as a real estate owner.
Totally.
A little bit of
the
pressure
push in the back.
Good,
yeah.
So funny enough, for me, and if Sarah, my assistant, ever watches this, she can confirm that I generally am not someone who needs artificial pressure.
Okay.
I feel it internally. I feel like every day is, it's your last day. And you just get it done.
Yeah, you've always operated with like a little chip on your shoulder, and hearing like the family history and stuff like that kind of puts it all in
100%.
perspective and together. But I want to hear about, what happened? You closed on 555, and this is a building that was owned by the same family for 70 years that lived in the building this whole time, and in comes you. So you walked in the building, right?
Yeah. So, it's an interesting thing, especially in markets like New York, a lot of the time in LA as well, and multifamily, especially rent controlled, which is our version of rent stabilization. You have to be realistic as a landlord or an owner of property as to the feelings and thoughts of people who live there, right? It's scary. These aren't people who can just afford to move somewhere else, and they've lived there oftentimes at 555. We've had people who have lived there for 40, 50 years, right?
Wow. And they're unaware that they even have the protections that they have. Sometimes it's just like this whole immediate fear, like,
Correct.
Oh my God, am I going to get kicked out?
Yeah.
And honestly, I think that, and I'm the first one to say this, I think that a lot of landlords are awful, like really bad. And historically they've been worse, right? So we look at the rent control dilemma that we have today. It didn't come out of nowhere, right? Like, you look at the history of real estate in New York, people were brutal. Landlords, owners of buildings were absolutely brutal to their tenants. I think now the pendulum has swung kind of in the opposite direction, in my opinion. I think that it's brutal to landlords in a lot of the ways that it's an unintended consequence. And look, it's very challenging to craft legislation that's even-handed and is trying to do something and does exactly that without collateral damage. But I think that, as someone who's buying a building, you have to be realistic about what people are imagining you to be, right? And perception is reality. And I think that people are very offended by that, but that's true, right? It's true in relationships, it's true in business, and it's true in a landlord-tenant dynamic. Your perception is your reality.
Yeah.
And so for me, something that I did, which is very dissimilar to a lot of people, was that in order to kind of make sure that people were on the same page as me, because in the end of the day, we bought a building that had a lot of challenges.
Yeah.
And we wanted to make it a great building. We wanted to make it cash flow well. We wanted it to be a profitable, but also, a good place for the people to live that were living there. So we had to work together. It was there's no way you can't not work together in today's day and age, in my opinion. So I went to the building and we had a number of tenant meetings where we brought pizza and drinks and all of that. And honestly, it was very adversarial in the beginning, from just because tenants didn't know what to expect. It's
Right.
like that's a scary
The
reality.
unknown is fearful.
Yeah. So what do? You called a meeting, you put flyers under everyone's door and said, "Hey, I'm
Yeah, so
the
we
new
have
owner. I'm
we
going
have
to be
a
there tomorrow."
property management group, and they basically had done that and circulated everything, and um, it was a little bit, from my perspective, you don't know what you're walking into. You don't know how angry people are going to be or what they're going to say or what they're going to do. And no one really wants to hear, not fun things about themselves for a couple of hours. But I think that if you can look at the big picture and think about what you're accomplishing, it becomes worth it. And I honestly, of maybe any building we own, my best relationships now are with the people that live at 555 Edgecombe.
That's
amazing.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So it's really, I mean, genuinely, they're amazing people. A lot of the time, people don't realize that, when you own real estate, yeah, it's a financial gain, and you're talking about a cap rate, which is essentially valuation of a loan or a bond or whatever you're thinking about, however you're valuing real estate. But this is a 128 unit building that has over 200 people living in it, that have lived there oftentimes for many, many years, have memories and stories there. And real estate is about the fact that it's real. It's an actual place that people interact with, and it has water leaks and roof incursions and, you know, employees and everything else. So it's a very interesting system to navigate through. And I really, it takes a lot it's not just on my part. The people that live there were willing to give me that chance, and I think that that's a
Well, I
huge
think
thing.
that part of what you had told us before was you asked them for that permission, which I think is something that if our listeners out there are wondering how to approach that situation, it's just that, call out the objection. I know what you're thinking. I'm here to rock the boat and do all this stuff, but in reality, I'm not. And if you give me the opportunity to show you what type of person I am, that's all I'm asking for today is the opportunity, to show you. And, you had the courage to ask that question, which I think is what most syndicators and people working on an Excel spreadsheet that are 10,000 miles away, they literally hide. Yeah.
I mean, look,
it takes courage.
Come on, they're in our political landscape today. It's really difficult, right, to be a landlord. Forget about just like the day to day, but the human aspect of it. Like, you're a person.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you're a person and you're a good person. But to run the buildings and take a lot of the abuse that comes with it is very challenging. And this was said to me the other day by a client who was coming up in the business, and then over the last couple of years, like, really took a significant step back, mostly because of the mental drain and emotional aspect that it took on him. And he was telling me, he's like, look, when I used to go to housing court when I first started, do you think I wanted to be there trying to evict these people? It's horrible. But this is a business, in order to keep the building maintained for everyone that lives there, not just this one tenant, like, there has to be some practical realities involved in that. But he was telling me, he's like, it's horrible. He felt really bad about it. And I think it's part of the business that isn't really talked about, right? The human aspect of what it takes to be a landlord. And I think what you've done by approaching tenants and being really proactive about introducing yourself. Like, we have clients who say, like, yeah, I own the building, but they'll never tell that to anyone. They walk in the building, just the manager. I work for the manager. I'm not like the guy. And I think a lot can be learned about how proactive you've been, especially in today's day and age, like fighting against HSTPA and this progressive political movement that actually ends up hurting the tenants just as much as it does the landlords.
Yeah, I would mention one thing just because you were talking about housing court. you know, oftentimes in today's market, right, you have situations where everyone in the building wants and needs that person out, not just because of the fact that they're not paying rent. We had at 596 Edgecombe, we had someone who was a very severe drug user and basically made this unit into like a drug den, pretty much. Obviously wasn't paying rent, but the reason why we were fighting it so hard was not because of the rent. It was because this is a huge danger to our residents in that building.
So, so do you have to evict that person through housing court, or did the police?
You have to
are the
evict
police
them.
helpful as
Not
far as
not
the drug
only
activity?
do you have to evict them, but this person left because they become vagrants at that point.
Right.
It's just they're in and out, and squatters had come. Just his buddies that were from the drug thing, and they were the ones that were there, and we had to get. I mean, they got issued stay after stay. We had to show up in court 5, 6, 7 times to get a warrant that then got, delayed another 30 days, and we kept fighting it. And we were trying to explain to the judge, this isn't because of the money. Like,
Right.
we're afraid for our tenants' safety.
Here's an
Yeah.
affidavit. Here's a petition by the other tenants.
And eventually we got them out, but those are the things that are hard for me as a landlord, is when you're just trying to help, like you're trying to do something good.
Yeah.
And the law is not there to protect squatters that are doing drugs in a building and stealing people's packages. It's there to protect, someone with young children that is down on their luck and missed 2 months of rent, right? And that makes sense, but it's about figuring out that middle ground.
Yeah,
So
there's got to be a balancing act, right?
Yeah.
Where are you seeing the biggest opportunity now? I mean, as somebody that has a national profile, maybe you're mostly just looking in the gateway cities, New York, LA, San Francisco. And at the time, I imagine what it seemed to appear is like the gross rent multiples outside of those metros were higher than New York City. And I'm still kind of getting the sense that the pricing hasn't almost like recalibrated to interest rates in some of these markets that were getting bid up at 2-3 caps, and now the Wall Street Journal's publishing about all these belly up, projects. But from a national landscape, do you still get the sense that gross rent multiples in apartment buildings or the best deals are in the gateway cities, or has it now gotten too expensive where it's kind of all just mushy together?
So, I think that it's a really important thing to remember that real estate value and value in general is very much tailored to who you are and what you need, right? Like what you were saying, Seth.
Yeah.
And there was actually, along the road, I've been very lucky to hear these amazing tidbits from really smart people that you can kind of borrow and make your own. And I was at a breakfast event where Sam Zell was speaking, and he was talking about his book. There's a whole chapter in his book, which I really highly recommend reading, where he says that liquidity equals value, right?
I remember.
So essentially, the premise of that statement is if you can't make your payroll, all the value in the world isn't going to do anything for you, right? If you can't make your mortgage payment or your property tax payment, great that you have all the value, but you don't have any cash flow, you're going to lose it all, right? And I think that that's true in any system, right? Energy gives you the ability to fight the second law of thermodynamics in the universe and to make it through entropy, right? And you think about that with real estate, you have to kind of do this balancing act where you need cash flow, you need to be able to make your payments, and if you're looking portfolio wide, you need to be able to get through. But if you can find the assets that most people can't get through, then that's where you're going to find the most value.
You're waiting for that liquidity to be needed for that asset class. I remember talking to a lot of industrial owners during the pandemic when industrial was super hot and is still very hot, and they were getting calls from some of the institutions, and they were like, I don't know what to do. This is like the easiest cream puff for me to own, this industrial on the west side of Manhattan, but I'm getting offered 2 and 2.5 caps from institutions, and I'm literally questioning them, why are they offering such a low cap rate? And the response was, well, they have to allocate a portion of their books to industrial, a greater portion of the total pie. So they're just trying to, weight allocation into that sector. And that's why they're willing to pay 2.5 caps. It has nothing to do with, is this the best deal? It's just, hey, when we have 100% of a pie, now instead of 10%, 20% needs to go to industrial, and you have what they want. So you're waiting for the liquidity to like find you. And lately in rent stabilized, it hasn't been there, but it'll return there if there's some normalcy to it, because before that used to be the best risk adjusted play in the entire country. You're starting out with $1,000 average rents, and yes, you might have to wait a long time for it to appreciate, but there wasn't, in theory, any downside. It was steady Eddie growth. Now we've been in a rent freeze for 4 years basically. But once that returns, once that mechanism for at least, medium-sized returns, I guarantee you all the institutions and just the safe pension fund money will return to that asset class, and values will inevitably go up.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say there was at Warren Buffett's annual shareholder meeting like a month or so ago, a friend of mine sent me 2 clips from it, and Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger were asked a question about the commercial real estate, and they're like, we're not really exposed to that stuff, we don't know much about it. And he said 2 things that I thought were really interesting in this topic, and it was about where are the opportunities right now and how are they created. And he said over the last 10 or 20 years, you've had the real estate business transform from a family operation to more of a syndication model where people are paid to buy property. Mm-hmm. And so the incentive is basically driven, the fees are driven to the syndication model, and that's used to drive pricing up, kind of like what you're talking about here with the warehouses on the west side. And as a result, there are going to be opportunities created because people paid too much for them. And he also said about how do you know the value of a property? And he's like, I don't know, like we don't really have any commercial real estate exposure, but it's basically the value of the property is whatever a bank is willing to give you.
I think he says more specifically whatever the amount of non-recourse debt you can acquire.
Bingo, yes. And look where we are now, right? And everything that was uber financeable went up in value like crazy. And now actually for rent regulated product, it's a lot harder to finance it. So maybe we could look at that as a pretty good opportunity right now.
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, you look at different asset classes and you think, okay, for us, if we have a 20 to 50 year investment horizon, right? What are the issues that are, call them white noise, right? Like just topical. Mm-hmm. And what are the issues that are ingrained in the asset? What is the value today and what is the value with a capital V, right? And I think that those things that are transient are, a lot of the times politics,
the laws,
right? Politics change every couple of years when people get voted in or voted out. Interest rates, political environments generally. What you have to look at is overall, where do you think the city is going to be in 20 years, 30 years?
So that's even more macro of a way of thinking about it. And I like that, that concept at all. It's just, if I own this a long enough time period, interest rates, politics will change, but this is a supply constrained market and it ain't changing.
Yep.
Yeah. We want to sort of wrap up here a little bit and finish with 2 questions. So pretend you're the mayor of New York. If you were the mayor of New York for one day and you had a little superpower.
As a resident of LA.
Yeah.
As a resident of LA, if you were the mayor of New York and you could snap your fingers and do something, what do you think you would do?
There are so many things that I think could be done. Obviously, just knowing any job, it's a lot harder when you're in it than when you're not. I think that the biggest thing is really balancing budgets and making smart choices that provide correct incentive structure. So, for example, something that I always think about is because you think about all this rent regulation and it creates this adversarial reality where, just to digress for 2 seconds, because whenever I think about these things, I think about the philosophical core to it, right? Okay. So think about capitalism as an idea, right? The idea of capitalism is basically that there's not a finite amount of gold in the world, that countries don't have to take gold from one another to become wealthier.
It's not a zero-sum
game. Grow the pie.
Yeah. So I think that over the course of time, people have lost that meaning of capitalism, and capitalism has come to be known as how much can I charge you because I know you need it, right? I.e., how can I take more from you, or how can you take more from me? And I think that idea has inculcated itself into the very mechanisms that we use to create policy, right? Landlord wants more rent, tenant wants to pay less. City needs to mediate between the two, cut the baby in half, right? Whereas another way to look at it would be, okay, city is spending X amount of money on regulation and all of these other issues. Tenants are paying this amount of rent. Landlords have these costs. Why not figure out something that reduces the cost for everyone? And then you're saving money. So, for example, if there's some kind of a tax rate incentive on property taxes for, covenanting a certain percentage of AMI on your rents, right? You today don't really get that option, right? If you have a vacant unit, it's either the legal rent, $600 once you've spent $100,000 renovating the unit, which means that you're going to warehouse it because there's nothing you can do, or the city's going to come up and say, okay, we're going to pay for your renovation or whatever it is. But if you could say, look, I'm not going to increase this 2-bedroom unit to 2,700, I'll charge you 1,800, and then everyone's, you're saving a portion of that on property taxes. It makes sense all around. So what I would do is lock a bunch of people in a room that are from the tenant side, advocacy side, the landlord advocacy side, the banking side, and the city's controller. Turn up the heat really high.
Yeah, let's just go to one of these warehouse vacant apartments. Let's have a meeting there.
And just say, like, let's figure this out in a way that's actually mutually beneficial and not, who can steal the most gold from the other person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is what Shaun and I do when two attorneys go back and forth and can't sign a contract in a month. We lock them in a room and don't let them come out until the contract's signed. Just give them a bunch of coffee and tell them the bathroom's broken, and you can use it.
Maybe we can apply the same rule to Washington with the debt ceiling.
Yeah. Oh, that would be nice.
So,
all right, last fun question here. I know you're a little bit of a history buff. If you could have dinner with one person, dead or alive, who would it be?
Also a really tough one. I would probably say George Washington.
Back.
Yeah. Going way back. I think, probably one of the most misunderstood characters in history, or at least in recent history. Incredibly challenging life, amazing attention to detail, grit, refusal to accept his defeat. And when you read about it and you learn about his life, just tremendous loss. All of the big gains in his life occurred as the result of someone that he loved dying, which is pretty wild to think about. Overall, it would be pretty interesting to see how he chewed with the wooden teeth.
I was going to say, what do you
He's got wooden teeth.
Oh, yeah.
Wooden teeth.
He did. They were
and a nice wig.
Ivory afterwards,
right?
But yeah.
Really?
When he was poorer, they were wooden, and then he got an ivory set.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know. I mean,
Yeah.
Who would know that? That's unbelievable. Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
how about you?
Oh, come on. Who would I have dinner with, dead or alive?
Last week it was your uncle.
Last week it was my uncle who fought in the war, and I think it would be really interesting to
World War II.
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting to know what that experience was like. I was down in Miami over the weekend, and I got into an Uber, and the Uber driver didn't speak any English.
Wow.
And so we were talking. I was sitting in the front seat next to him, and we were talking. And he's from Cuba, and he came a year ago to the U.S.
Wow.
And I was with him for like 15 minutes, and he told me his whole story. And I would love to spend another hour with that guy. He barely spoke English, and I got by with Spanish, but learning about what it was like to come from Cuba to the United States as an illegal immigrant he paid 10 grand to smugglers.
Oh my God.
He didn't like get on a boat and go to Miami. He went to like Nicaragua, El Salvador, through Mexico, like up the Rio Grande, and he was telling me about all the hardship and stuff like that he went through and how long it took him. And you read about this stuff, right? Especially now, and I was like kind of amazed, and I would like to learn more about that and what his personal experience was like. This is my Uber driver.
The last thing that I would mention is that, real estate is, in the end of the day, people, right? It's people driven. You're buying and selling from people. You're working with people. The people that use your buildings are also surprisingly people. And we forget a lot of the time that there's so much fun in getting to know who people are and what their story is. And that's really one of the things that I think stops you from getting into the despair feeling of all of this awfulness, is just how fun is it that we get to meet all these cool people.
Right.
Yeah. Riney, who would you have dinner with?
Well, last week, right now, I would say Elon Musk is
Elon Musk.
Yeah,
second date with Elon Musk.
I think to the point about where the hockey puck is going, which is what the question I'm always trying to ask myself, I think he's got the best answers to that. But this has been really helpful. Aron, I think you come across as the property owner that the city needs, deeply thoughtful, caring, in it for the long buck and not the short buck. And we had a great time today, and
thank
you for
coming on.
Thank you.
It was good seeing you. Thank you.
Good to see you too. This is really fun.